Welcome to this stream on a Sunday evening. I'm your host, Adam Steele, and tonight we're going to be talking about mixing an acoustic kind of indie folk kind of track. So, quite different from the previous streams we've done over the last couple of weeks, which have been quite kind of heavy pop punk, metal, that kind of stuff. This is going to be quite different. This is going to be working with compression without killing it, working with nice big sounding drums without sounding fake. This is going to be looking at mixing as an art of balance. So let's run the intro, and without further ado, we'll get cracking. And here we are back at the start. Greetings to the Bommel in chat. Good to see you. So tonight's video is going to be live, as it says. So there are going to be a couple of bits here that are probably less than smooth. It's going to be a typical live video. Now, it may go on a while, and that's absolutely fine. So in front of me, I have Reaper, as always. And I also have this song by a band called Sandboy. Now, Sandboy are a band that no longer exist, but members of Sandboy are now part of a very well-regarded Manchester band called Last Race Home. And those guys are doing really rather well for themselves. But I recorded this with Sandboy. Let's just find out from one of these files where it was recorded. February 2013. So this set of recordings is over 7 years old now, and it's interesting how it's all kind of aged. So let's press play and make sure you can all hear things. This is not mixed yet. This has a couple of very basic things on here, so this is not going to sound great, and that's kind of the point of today's video.
Golden opportunity staring right in front of me. Call on me. The oceans of a single life are rough.
Cool. And it kicks in later on with
Sugar coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say,
So there's lots to get on with. There's a nice big drum kit with a tambourine, which we'll be looking at in depth and making sure that sounds nice. There's a bass that I've just got a DI for. Then there's a couple of acoustics. I've got the vocals from the main singer Neil.
And can't you see? Sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say,
And then I've got a backing vocal,
can't you see?
which is sat nicely underneath. Hello to people in chat. Hello Terry. Hello David. There's a harmonica, which in the mix which went out for release was completely muted, and I've decided I'm going to bring it back and bring it in. Good stuff. Now let's see. I could have sworn I set this to 44k earlier. Let's just see if this breaks everything if I hit that. One, two, yep, it's 1 second, everybody. I'm having some device issues here. Disable all enhancements. That should be at 44.1. Should be... There we go. Can everybody hear me now? Because that was really annoying, working across different sample rates. I set everything... This particular project was recorded at 44.1k because this was destined for CD release, which back in 2013 was still a relevant concern for indie bands. But I usually work now at 48 because that's kind of the... What's the word? It's the kind of film and streaming preferred rate. So that's what I tend to go with, being a YouTube kind of guy. But my audio interface decided it wanted through the Windows drivers to go, I'm going to go 48, I'm going to go 44. So that was an absolute nightmare. But that has now sorted itself out. There we go. And so, we can hear, what else have we got in this mix? We've got trumpets. We've got real trumpets. So I've actually got the... Yes, majestic. I'm going to turn these ones down a little, but later on in the song we've got proper blasting. There we go. I've just turned the clip gains down on these. You can actually see on the waveforms here that the waveform looks kind of off-center. It looks like there's some sort of issue, but there isn't. What's happening there is the trumpet is blasting the capsule in that microphone so hard, because trumpets are loud, that it's actually kind of pinning the diaphragm back on the mic a little bit, but it's still within expected limits. That's what you would expect to see, whereas you see here it's much more linear. Here it's where it's real loud stuff. So this is a soft section trumpet where it looks kind of symmetrical. There. Whereas later on, and that is perfectly normal, ladies and gentlemen. So there is what we described as an electric guitar, which I've still muted because it was actually an EQ from an acoustic guitar. Let's just bring the volume up on these. And then we've got lots of acoustic guitar DIs, which is the rest of the tracks here. So this is so far. That's actually that's a pizzo acoustic from a pickup on an electroacoustic, but the guitarist insisted on using that because he had effects that he wanted to use that added to the sound. But if I turn off these two little plugins here, you might want to brace yourselves for this sound, because this has got some serious low ending that makes the sub in my headphones go funny, but this is how it sounded originally. So yeah, I don't know if you're listening on full range systems, but there's a proper whoop 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 on the bottom there. And so the first thing that I did is, using the Reverb Reaper plugin, I added something that I bought very recently, which is one of the 3 Sigma acoustic impulses. So another clever thing you can use impulse responses for is I'm making this pizzo sound like a Gibson Birdland acoustic, and it does this. Which sounds a lot closer to a proper microphone than it does than this does. And it takes that sub out, and then beyond that, that extra plugin is just scooping out some of that low end, because it was a real thump thump thump. And There we go. So it's still not an amazing guitar sound, but it's something I can work with. And so, what else have we got? There's just more guitar parts. So there's one where he used a backwards effect, which I definitely want to get in there. And then one that's really loud there, where they wanted it to be really coming up in the mix. That one I've left as is, that's going to need some serious mixing. Then there's... Again, if I take the plugin off that... Ooh. So that impulse response is not only taking the super sub out, but it's giving the whole thing a little bit more space and a bit more realism because it's kind of time domain based. And then there's this section as well, which... Again, sounds fairly reasonable. And then last but not least to part of this mix is we recorded this. We used something that sounded like a Hammond B3. I don't have the original plugin 7 years on, but what I do have is Arturia's B3, and I've got it set to sound like this. There we go. So it's quite a nice drawbar organ sound. And originally the plugin that we used the sustain pedal to trigger the speed, which you can see at the bottom here, for the what do you call it? Come on, brain. The Leslie, which if I'm holding that down, it's quite a nice slow pan. If I click that, it goes much faster. And so the Arturia one doesn't use the whole pedal, so I had to use a little plugin in Reaper called a MIDI CC mapper, which changed it from that hold pedal, which was actually doing sustain and making it sound awful, to a completely different MIDI CC, and then in the Wurlitzer B3, I could then hit the MIDI icon up here, and then touch MIDI learn here. There we go. And then just by tweaking that control, that then becomes slow and fast as we need. There we go, because I do find that a fast Leslie makes something stand out more in the mix, whereas a slow Leslie makes it sit back in the mix without a volume change. There we go. On a separate note here, before I go any further, tonight's stream is brought to you with my co-host, Mr. Malbec. This is a nice barefoot Malbec. Everybody would think I'm an alcoholic from watching these streams, because I always seem to have a drink in my hand. But truth be told, aside from these actual streams, I very rarely drink. So yes, you ladies and gentlemen are driving me to it. I'm kidding, of course. This is kind of my unwinding time. Which is probably why I've been getting some really good mixes doing these streams recently, because I'm not pressured, I'm not time constrained. So, cheers everybody. Ooh, fruity. So, we've got to try and somehow make all these fit together. Right now, that sounds to me like an amateur demo, because that's generally what amateur demos used to consist of, was get the basic, sound right on each channel, and then just slap them all down and go. And what we want is to make it sound like something that's cohesive. So for me, we're going to start with the drums. So the drums are Stephen Slate drums, as they have been for the last few sessions, but they are a completely different set of drums to what they have been. So I was looking through the presets to get me roughly in the right ballpark, and then I've done a little tweaking. So the kick drum now, it was like a 22-inch, really short kick that did that ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba thing for rock. This is the complete opposite. This is a 26-inch Ludwig that sounds like a cannon. Sounds like that. Which is kind of soft, mellow, unfocused. For a song like this, that's kind of what I want. I don't want an overly large amount of click or attack or anything like that. The snare, because I have one snare on this, was... let's have a look. Snare... Sonar, I think? Really low tuned. The toms I don't think we even use, but they're Ludwigs. I don't think they get used in this song. Hi-hat's quite a nice Zildjian 14-inch, quite dark. Cymbals also relatively dark. Dark seems to be the aim of the game here, because I definitely... Ooh, I might change the ride out. I don't think the ride gets used in this song. But I want dark cymbals to just sit in the background. I don't want anything on this drum kit to become punchy and attacky and a feature. I want everything to be warm and soft and enveloping. So this is how the drum kit sounds, just laid out across a load of tracks. Now, the one thing that I have already gone ahead and done... yes, the phone is just telling me that I'm live. Yes, I already know that. Thank you very much, phone. The two things are the tambourine is not MIDI. The tambourine is real. And it was recorded at the time, which gives it a definite feel and a thing, a vibe, which I'm going to come back to. So I'm going to turn that off for a minute. And just... There we go. Because, one of the reasons that we can have the drum kit quite dark is that tambourine's going to fill in that top end quite nicely without being over-intrusive. And then if the high end is too much, I can just turn the tambourine down. And then I've got a nice kind of balance then of weight with the drum kit, top end on the tambourine. Now, one more thing to talk about is on the master bus I've got a few things going on which is slightly different to the other streams I've been doing. If I turn them all off... The drum kit will sound good, but it won't quite sound like I expected it to. So that's the drum kit now. So what I've got, first thing, is... Let's just look at this plugin. So first I've got Slate Virtual Mix Rack on the master bus, because the master bus for me on kind of this more acoustic style track is probably more useful and more relevant than on rock stuff and metal stuff where we're being super precise and super surgical. I actually want kind of a big, warm, fat, enveloping sound where I want to do ideally as little as possible on each separate instrument. So what I've got, firstly I've got a trimmer that just takes the volume down because with all my faders at 0, some of the tracks were adding up to be a little too much and we're starting to clip the master bus, which I don't want. Or at least getting dangerously close to it. So there was that. And then there was the London console and the virtual tube consoles, which is on console mode with a little bit of saturation. Originally, when we did this song, we had the EMI Red Desk in mind and were trying out the Waves plugins at that time. So that's the kind of thing that I've gone with here, and that's kind of a 50-50 mix. So that's letting the clean sound through, but also giving us a bit of just kind of richness that's not overly crunchy and distorted. It's just a certain saturation. And then I've got 2 sets of the custom series equalizer here on the master bus. So this one is pushing the low end and pushing the high end, just to sweeten them. And then the second one is doing the opposite. But you would think, like, by looking at these, that these just counteract each other, and you would think, well, what's the point then? But that's not how the passive tube equalizers work. They actually work quite differently from each other. The lifts will have kind of an EQ bump and will lift at certain different places, whereas the high-end cut will be more of a much more gentle shelf starting around 3 or 4K. And then same with the low end. The low end might have a low end bump, and then the low end dip will be much more smooth. So let's just play the drums with these and then without. So this is with... Yeah, let's turn the trimmer off for a sec. So that's with everything on, and then I'll turn them all off. And that's with everything off. And then with everything on. So with all of this turned on, it's a very difficult thing to categorize, but what's happening is the low end sounds fuller. There's kind of a low mid wall that's already taken out of the overall mix, and that's very pleasing to me. Then there's Kazrog True Iron, which I use on everything, but that's got a bit of a boost and a bit of a push today because it's got that vintage fat transformer thing that would happen naturally on a mix from the 60s because the mixing desks ran through big fat transformers because it was the only real way to get sound out properly balanced without any distortion issues. So that's going to sound louder, unfortunately, but without. Sounds like this, and with. Without. And with. There we go. So transformer saturation is like a part of a mixing desk or even a guitar amp or anything like that that you would want to push without distorting the rest of it. And that's why I love the True Iron plugin, because it's not trying to be a distortion unit. It's just doing very subtly what real big fat iron transformers would do. And then the real pièce de résistance on this track particularly is the Slate virtual tape machine. So this is really, really making me happy because it's a a half-inch 2-track tape machine running at a slower 15 inches per second, which of course in the 60s, which is when I imagined this mix to kind of come together from, that would have been as fast as you could get back then. And the 456 tape is as high headroom as you would have had back then. So if I turn that on and off, here's it off, and here's it on. I'll get to a section with some real snare going on. Off. There we go. So it's very subtle, but that's going to affect our entire mix, which means that we can get more out of less, as it were. So on the whole drums, I've split them across several channels. I'm just going to check. I don't think... Yeah, this song doesn't actually use any toms, which is fine because that means I can just mute the tom channels. And then just... Because if I don't delete them, if I just mute them and then leave it like that, that means that if I ever decide that I need to use this particular drum kit setup in any other project, I can literally copy and paste the whole thing. So I may as well. And I'm going to get sidetracked by saying this, but if anybody has any questions they would like to throw in, they are more than welcome. There was a big discussion on the Slate Audiophiles Facebook group earlier where someone was saying, oh, do you prefer short or long tutorials? And everyone's saying, no, I prefer short because I can't focus or I want to know what I want to know. And I'm like, well, here's the opposite. And it's the opposite, and these are long format videos because the way that I work in terms of mixing, as you can see from these types of streams, is very dependent. It depends entirely on what it is that you're trying to get out of a stream. If I just said, get big drums, do a bit of this, do a bit of that, that wouldn't really help you in context. And context is everything. So, let's have a listen to this. Cool. So, first thing we're going to do with this drum kit is I'm going to work top down in this case. With rock and metal, I do tend to process channels separately first, but what I want to do here is, like I said, have a big, warm, fat sound that envelops me right from the beginning, and almost approach this from a vintage perspective. So, first thing that I want to do is love the Reaper skin. The Reaper skin's default. That's Reaper 6 default. All I've done is... Oh, that's something that I did do, actually, is I went through and I'll just shift and click a load of channels, and then right-click, go to track color, and then set tracks to one random colour for say, the drums, then the bass, then the acoustic. So the colour palette hasn't been chosen by me, it was just at random, but it means that I can see very quickly, those are the drums, that's the bass, those are the guitars, those are the vocals, harmonica, trumpets, acoustic guitars, which are further down in my mix this time because they're features rather than staples, and the organ at the end, and then the effects, and then some extra tracks which we're not using. Don't use a uniform colour palette? Nope. Nope. Call me chaotic, call me what you will. But I don't bother spending the time looking for separate colours. This colour for this colour for that, because every mix that comes to me can be quite different. Every mix that comes to me can have a completely different set of instruments. I don't just work on one genre, so I can't afford to be so specific, so I leave it dynamic and I just go, well, these are a colour. And in the context of the mix, these are the colour for that. So yeah, call me crazy, call me chaotic, but I just find that it's not worth being that picky. I just don't spend that time on it. I free my resources up brain-wise. And especially considering that the takes, when you do multiple takes, they colour themselves in a random order so that you can see. By the time they've done that, it's no longer useful to me to do, this colours for this colours for that. Like, the bass, for instance, is now a green track, but everything on there's purple and pink. And that's just because several takes were done, and the ones that we landed on happened to be that colour. So, yeah, David says, I'm way more OCD than you. And that's fine. You do you, man. If you want things properly coloured in a certain way, like, if I select all my bass tracks, I can go to... where's track colour now? I don't even use any of that stuff. Item and take colours. Set to custom colour, let's say that green. And that didn't even do it, why not? Probably because the takes have already got their own colours. Oh yeah, set active takes to custom colour. There we go. You can do that if you want. For me, by the time I've done that, I could have been halfway through the mix. David's got a template set up to automatically colour each group when you insert them to a folder. Sure, cool. And that sounds great. For me, it's just an extra step. But yeah, cool. If it works for you. Reaper's incredibly powerful, and I see a lot of Reaper users doing things like that are quite custom to each person. And that's great. So, let's have a look at this kit again. First thing that I want to do to this kit is have a big, ridiculous, slow compressor. And actually what I'm going to use isn't a Slate plugin at all. It's going to be Devil Lock Deluxe from Sound Toys. Now there's a preset called Drum Giant Size. There's only a few knobs, so I mean you don't have to do this, but it's a bit of crush and a bit of crunch, slow release, and listen to this. I'll put the mix on 0 and bring this up. There we go. So it absolutely kills the drums and then blends it in slightly. There we go. So I'm just going to pull up the drum MIDI on a separate window here, because I know there are a couple of snare hits that are really hard in comparison to everything else. So one thing I do want to do with the snare, I'm going to bring up Virtual Mix Rack, and I just want to compress that. So what I want to do specifically is, when the snare is playing most of the time, have a kind of a 3-to-1 compressor using this FG401 because it's a VCA compressor, so it's quite punchy, quite aggressive. And I want it to do nothing most of the time. So what I want to do, there we go. Pull the threshold down until it was pulling the VU meter, then pull it back until it's not doing anything. Because what I want is for that not to be compressing the snare most of the time because I don't need it. But then when there's a really hard hit, that should hopefully pull it back in. So I'm going to go back in the track a little. So it's just bum, 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 da on the snare. There we go, cool. So there's a trimmer here pushing the snare volume up because most of the time the drummer was really tickling that snare to give it a particular tone. But I've brought the volume up on it so that we could hear it because otherwise it completely gets lost in the drum mix. It was quite nice, but yeah, looks like I'll need a heavier ratio on this. And let's just try it again on the... There we go. So that's how it is most of the time. There we go. So that's really pulling that snare volume down now. And that should... I did want the snare to have a bit of an accent at that point, but not nearly what it had, which was quite a scary kind of thing. Now... There we go. Those hi-hats and a lot of the room have got a kind of a... what I would call a nastiness in the bottom of the... So I'm going to bring a virtual mix rack, as I tend to do, and use the SSL EQ here on that overhead. Or was it? No, it was the room, sorry. And then in the kind of the low mids, I'm going to start around 250 and just poke that out and see if I can find that sloshing on the hi-hats. There it is, around 360 it says. There we go, so I've pulled some of that out now. So that's the hi-hat mic soloed, which is fine. And there's a lot of sloshing on the overheads as well, so I'm going to be just as surgical with the overheads. I might use a slightly different frequency spot, which is why I'm doing this separately, but I'm going to get quite specific here. Yeah, so on the overheads I'm cutting lower down. Let's see how the whole kit sounds together. Cool, so the Devil Lock is really screwing things up, which is nice, but I need to back that mix right off. That's with the mix at like 0.5 out of 10. Right, there we go. And I do want that snare to be a bit more present in this mix. I'm going to try the API EQ. I very rarely use it, and I'm just going to add a bit of... I'm going to start with 1.5k on that snare. I don't want it to be aggressive, I just want it to be more forward. There we go. 3k is more like it. And that 100 Hz at the bottom there is just giving it a bit more weight so it doesn't just sound like cardboard. Still something in there I don't like. Let's try 400 Hz. Yeah, there we go. So just take a little bit of that 400 Hz out. I do like how the API clicks, so you don't have the option of something point something dB. It's just 246. And yes, I know you can fine tune it, but I don't want to. I like that as a feature. There we go. And that kick now just has a little bit of pillowiness that I'm not too fond of, but I don't want to be too aggressive with this, so I'm going to use the custom EQ and just see, is it 400 Hz-ish? Yeah. There we go. So just added a little bit 100 hertz and taken out quite a bit at 400. Added a bit of 4K, but because it's not a clicky, aggressive kick, there's not a lot there at 4K, so it's not doing a huge deal. It's just bringing that buh to the front rather than wah. It's just giving it a bit of the B of the bang, as it were. So let's try this. Let's add in that tambourine. Cool. Now at this point, I'm going to throw in a couple of reverbs. Now this is where it gets a little fun, because I get to use Lustrous plates, which is a relatively new plugin for me. And I tend to start with I think it's the large dark vocal plugin, the preset, which is it sounds like a real plate reverb to me, but I do like to use the EQ to take out loads of low end. And there we go. I think that's something that a lot of Motown guys used to do, is have a big plate that goes on quite a lot, but take the low end out so it doesn't sound awful. Now let's just try a little bit of this on. Let's just take away all these, because these shouldn't be on. And firstly, let's just add a little bit to the snare. So let's unmute it and add it to the snare. There we go. So that's what it's doing to the snare there. There we go. I'm just going to remove all these sends, because these are from a previous mix. So there we go. Get rid. Changing mix parameters on the fly. There we go. So let's call this plate 1 room verb. There we go. So they'll do. And then I've got Verb Suite Classics I'm going to use here. And this is what I do on pretty much every mix, is I use the BM7 Studio B Close. Although I might use Studio A today. Let's see how Studio A sounds just on the tambourine. And also on plate. That tambourine suddenly doesn't sound. That was on its own. That's through Studio A. Studio A is probably appropriate for this mix. Studio B, I do tend to find, is the much more focused one. But Studio A is much bigger, but probably much more diffuse, which for this song's probably perfect. So let's get the drum kit going. Let's get a bit of top end on that. Right, I'm going to change a couple of little things here. I'm going to really roll the top end off that tambourine, which sounds really weird. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to use air and just use a high cut and then just roll it back until it sounds a bit too muffled. There we go. So that tambourine's now sat on top of everything, and I'm going to use the virtual mix rack on the whole drums, which has nothing in so far. I'm going to add the virtual mix bus of the RC tube. Sounding nice. Yeah, I'm going to use a Neve and just add a little high end to the whole drum kit. There we go. And that's nice. So I'm going to add some room reverb now. To that snare. That might be all we need. There we go. Yeah, that's how an undamped 26-inch kick drum sounds, ladies and gentlemen. From here, I'm going to add in a bass and then add the acoustics on, so I've got the fundamentals of a track. Now, I remember this being kind of like a Gibson EB0 type bass. And I really, really don't like the sound of those kind of basses. Nothing personal against anybody. But as a DI sound, I just think that sounds horrible. So I'm going to bring in Ampex SVX. Just going to make sure the cabinet's off. Yep. I don't need it. There we go. There we go. So I've got a nice top. Then I'm going to use Wall of Sound with, no surprise, one of my own cabinets, because of course I would. Why would I not? But I think in this case, I'll download that later, I think I'm going to use the Brit Fridge without the T. So, oh yes. Because that naturally compresses. And just a little bit of overload. There we go. Move away from the center of the cone a little bit. And there is a nice big round drum sound with practically no compression on it. Bass sound even. So I'm going to add a little bit of the room reverb to that. I've said before, one of my favourite tricks on bass to make a nice warm, realistic bass is add room reverb to it. And that sounds like it shouldn't work. But an amp in a real room, what does that do? It gives us a saturation and a roundness from the room that fills a mix when you've got other microphones in the room. And that's how you pull a big mix together. I'm going to use a bit of virtual mix rack on here just to use this compressor again. And also put mix bus on here with the RC tube, which I think is going to be a common theme. So there we go. Circuit 2 is much more of a, what's the word? It's more opto, so it's got, there we go, a much more realistic kind of sound. Let's blend that in with the drum group. Turn the output way down on Wall of Sound. Turn the channel strip up. I never like having my channels that far down. There we go. So I've got a nice big diffuse bass sound that's thumping along nicely. Still sounds quite real-ish, but it's got that big, amp saturation thing going on. It's got a nice softness to the top end because the bottom's not filled out by EQ, it's filled out by room, bloom and amp saturation and all the kind of stuff that makes a mix much more believable. So that sounds nice to me. Now let's bring these acoustic guitars in. Let's put these two acoustics, which are hard pan left and right, into their own group. Now let's see what we can do about these to make these much more big and lively and just huge. So first thing's true iron. So true iron's really gonna kill these. There we go. Without. And that's really bringing in a certain richness to the kind of upper mids without having any spiky EQ stuff in there. Let's bring in virtual mix rack. Let's add in that room reverb. There we go. So there's quite a lot of that room reverb on there, but it sounds quite nice. Do I ever experiment with the other transformers in True Iron? I have done, and to be honest, I didn't really like what the others did nearly as much. I find that most of them are either more mid-focused or they saturate more easily. The first one, the 108X, is just the one that appeals to me, and so that's the one that I go for. There's no clinical reason, and if the others did a thing that I liked, I would use them more, but for me, I'm quite happy using the one that I've landed on, which is the 108X. And if I was going to use real transformers in something and I had a choice, money, no object, they're probably the ones I would pick by the sound of it. So yeah, hope that answers that question. So we've now got some nice room on our acoustics. So I'm going to bring in a compressor that doesn't do much. There we go. Now that doesn't sound like it's doing very much to me, but I can see the meters going on the big hits, which means it's probably going to stand in a mix a little nicer. So let's get mix bus on RC tube there. I am going to add the air EQ, and I'm adding my EQs before my compressor here because that should probably affect the way the compressor works. I'm going to take out the super low end on the Neve, which is very gentle. I'm going to use air and really bring some top end in. There we go. And just a little bit of that 100 Hz kind of Neve thing just makes it sound a little fuller to me, but without being overbearing. If it sounded a bit wub wub wub, maybe because of proximity effect on the mic or whatever, I definitely wouldn't be adding any more of that, or I'd be looking to take away some low mids there, which I apparently don't need to do. But now let's listen to this in the mix and see if my suspicions are confirmed. So drums, bass, and then let's bring in this acoustic. Sounding decent. What I probably do want to do, just to fill this mix out a little, is after the compressor, use Revival with a bit of thickness and shimmer, which will make it sound louder without being much more in terms of dB. But it's much more of kind of like a parallel EQ. It doesn't really crank any particular frequency. So let's try adding a bit of them in until it really kind of sits more in the mix, because it's a little low right now, but I don't want to push the volume any further. That's sounding nice. The snare now sounds a little bit wet. So what I might do, and this is something I can definitely do that's a bit cheeky, is I can bring up the original MIDI and just tweak this to actually have him hit it a little harder. Can do that. Where are you? There we go. Not overbearingly hard. So there we go. So where I went to was too hard, and where I started wasn't hard enough. Let's try that. Yeah. There we go. The snare does sound a little papery, and that's probably that extra 3K boost just being too much. There we go. So I backed off the 3K boost a bit. Hello to NP in chat. I gave it a little bit more low end because now that I've got the bass and the acoustic group on top of the drums, I've got more context for that snare, and that 3K made it sound too kind of papery. So I backed that off. I do like the boost, so I've kept a couple of dB and a bit more low end, and I used the makeup gain on the compressor just to put a few dB in without poking the snare bus too hard. And now hi to Chris. There we go. I'm going to be doing a metal stream in probably a week's time ish again, just to do more metal. But for now, this is our lot. We have nice big fat drums, big round bass, and quite present but not overly bright acoustic guitars. There we go. Ended up bringing my acoustic down a little bit there. So, on to vocals, and I'm going to make a vocal group. Hello to Rumi as well. We're starting to get a bit of a crowd in. Way! Make me a vocal group before I begin, because some of this stuff never got used in the end and some did. So let's have a look. So this is, I'm going to bring the volume. This was all zoomed in, by the way. The volumes weren't actually tracked that loud. They're more like this. Proper gain staging is important, people. What are we drinking today? A fine Malbec in a glass as large as my head. So, yes. Everybody pause for alcohol. So the vocal group is going to be a nice fat group. So on this mix, so on the mix group there, I am going to put my VCC mix bus with RC tube on there before we even begin with the vocals. Let's just listen to just vocal number 1. I did already go ahead and do some work on this, because on its own it sounded very thin and or at least didn't sound right, because the singer Neil had a very, very dynamic voice, and without any of this it sounded like this.
Golden opportunity staring right in front of me, called on me up. The oceans of a single life are rough.
Which actually isn't a bad vocal performance. So the first thing I did is I had the channel running through RC tube to give it a bit more fatness, a bit more, when he belts it, a little bit of not necessarily all out distortion, but a bit of kind of grit, because in a vintage situation that's what's going to happen on a vintage mixing desk. And then I'm into the Hollywood virtual tube, which is on the preamp, and just a little bit of saturation, which is also taken out below 120ish hertz, because I don't know if you could hear on that there, but there were a couple of kind of pop-pops and rumbles. And then I've got a little bit too much in the low mids. I almost always end up going to around 500 hertz on vocals and just taking things out a bit. Added a bit more that low endness in, and I've used the thickness and a lot of shimmer on Revival. So let's listen without the compressors for a sec.
Golden opportunity staring right in front of me.
And without.
Golden opportunity staring right in front of me.
So again, that line without any of this preamp EQ stuff.
Staring right in front of me.
And with.
Staring right in front of me.
There we go. So a lot of that apparent high end is from this shimmer on Revival, but the rest of it is actually from the harmonics created by the Virtual Channel and the Virtual Tube collection. As you can see, there's no high end lift on that Neve there. So next thing, I've got the FG116 Vintage, which is an 1176, which isn't doing much. That's just taking some of the peaks off stuff.
Staring right in front of me.
Or at least that's the idea.
Call on me up. The oceans of a single life are rough.
And then, of course, my favourite, the Monster, which is another 1176, but really killed. And I'll just...
And thoughts are drifting through my head. And words are better left unsaid. No. Call on me up.
And that really helps that to sit on top of a mix. So let's see where we're at if I bring in the bass, acoustic, drums, and this vocal.
Golden opportunity staring right in front of me. Call on me up.
So I'm going to put the room reverb and the plate on the vocals. It's going to absolutely drown it for a second.
Golden opportunity.
Yep, so I'm going to back them off a bit.
Golden opportunity staring right in front of me. Call on me up.
That's a thought. I'm going to go back and change these compressors on the bass and acoustic in a minute to the True Dynamics. But first, let's see if I can bring... In fact, yeah, let's use True Dynamics on the vocal bus here. I know it's more compression on compression, but with this LA1B, let's just use this to try and sit this vocal on top of the mix, because it's very mute compression, so it won't do much until it's...
Golden opportunity staring right in front of me. Call on me up. The oceans of a single life are up.
Nice.
And thoughts are drifting through my head. And words are better left unsaid. No. Call on me up. You better know where your single life is up. And I do believe you, and you do believe it.
I'll take a bit low end back out of that snare, because it's just kind of making me feel a bit queasy underneath the vocal there.
What comes of it? You better know where your single life. And I do believe you, and you do believe it.
Cool. So, the second vocal...
And I do believe you, and you do believe it too.
Cool. This second vocal just needs... I'm probably going to hammer it with True Dynamics. I'm going to use the Presto, actually.
And I do believe you, and you do believe it too.
Cool. Australian Red, 19 Crimes, and Rosé. Cheers. So this secondary vocal is now being quite heavily compressed. I mean, the tuning's not perfect on it, but it's supposed to be a supporting vocal anyway.
And can't you see Sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, oh, 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 we better off alone.
Cool. So what I want to do there is get that. How was I doing this before? I want to do it as a kind of a stereo thing. I'm going to use the Howard Benson plugin, just because it's really really useful for these kinds of things. So turn all that off and just use the multiplier and the width.
And can't you see? Sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, oh, 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 we better off alone.
There we go. Turn it down a little because we don't need much of this. Actually, let's get the EQ back and just push that kind of low mid region, which I very rarely do.
And can't you see?
Because I don't need any detail, I don't need any high end on the backing vocal, I don't need much extra low end either. But let's try this. I want more plate and more room on it.
Can't you see? Sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, oh, oh, we better off alone.
Let's turn that other vocal off.
Oh, we better off alone.
I actually want a bit tube warmth and probably a bit more compression out of the Howard Benson actually, just to get this to sit underneath.
Oh, we better off alone. Oh, we better off alone.
Down a little bit.
We better off alone.
That's nice. That tube warmth has just suddenly sat it.
And I do believe, and I do, and I do, and I do.
Let's just see if a bit of our friend auto-tune fixes that.
And I do believe you.
Right, so it's supposed to be A harmonic, so it's C major. I'm going to make sure it doesn't overly auto-tune it by changing the speed.
And I do believe you.
There we go. And none on the main vocal, of course.
And I do believe you. And you do believe it. What comes of a broken heart? What comes of a broken heart?
There we go. So back to the main vocal group. There are a couple of harmonies here I need to just fit in. So I'm going to slap the same auto-tune on these to make sure that these all harmonise nicely.
Whoa, you better off alone. Whoa, 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 you better. Whoa,
Okay, so that's getting compressed to hell.
whoa, you better off alone.
And that one.
Whoa.
That one just needs a bit of EQ because that's way too kind of stuffy sounding. So let's just get Neve.
Whoa.
So that needs a
Whoa.
lot more high end, a lot less
Whoa.
of that low endy stuff. Same Howard Benson-y stereo-y goodness, but without all the extra saturation.
Whoa.
Let's see how that works.
Whoa, you better off alone. Whoa, you better off alone.
Still got all that stuff to fit in the mix yet. This could get real busy real fast. So I'm going to mute the harmonica and I'm going to make a solo group because I didn't do any grouping on these before. There we go. So I'll get that in there. Next thing I think I'm going to fit in this mix is the organ, because the organ can sit around the acoustic guitar quite nicely, so that becomes my next priority.
Can't you see? The sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, oh, 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 we're better off alone. Oh, can't you see? The sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, oh, 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 we're better off alone. And
There we go, basically undoing all my EQ work on the snare because it's making everything sound weird. But let's go back to the organ and get that to fit in, because it's too loud and proud right now. So I want to cake it in reverb before anything. Lots of room reverb. Lots of plate reverb as well, so it sounds physically huge. And then I want to start scooping away at frequencies until it fits. So I'm going to good old mix rack, and I want to be gentle with this. I'm using very little of the SSL EQ tonight because on a vintagey style mix I do want to be quite vintagey in my approach, and SSL's very 80s, very clinical, very precise for its time. And I'm kind of going more vintagey here, so this, let's start by taking all the low end out of the organ. And low mid. And then true dynamics again. So this one's probably, let's hit save. Presto. There we go. So that's just pinning this back a little bit. Let's hear this in the mix and see if that's right.
can't you see? The sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, oh, 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 we're better off alone. And oh, can't you see? The sugar-coated memories.
There we go, perfect. It's the kind of instrument where I can't tell if the level's right because it's supposed to be sat back, and the way to tell is just turn it off and then you miss it, and then turn it on and you're like, oh, there it is, but it's not poking out, but I don't miss it, and it's nice, and it fills a space. That's how I approach background instruments and flavour textures and that kind of thing. Is if I can't quite pick it out, and then I turn it off and I miss it, that's my key, that's my cue. So, moving on, this harmonica, like I say, wasn't in the original mix, so this could be fun. So the first thing I want to do is soak it in reverb. Then, next thing I'm going to do is really drastically alter the sound of it. I'm going to use the custom EQ, and I'm going to take out all that low end. And I'm going to take out a lot of top end as well, using the low. And I'm going to pan it off to one side. There's a real kind of low mid thing going on, which I'm going to take out. And then let's go with true dynamics again, because this is exactly the kind of thing that it'd be perfect for. Is let's try save the LA1B with a slow recovery time and just hammer it until it sits. Because what I really want is for it to sound quite natural, but for those big swells to just sit back. So let's see about pulling that into the mix.
Can't you see? The sugar-coated memories.
Sounds nice, but it's not got its own space in the mix. So this is where I'm going to add another, let's call this preverb. It's just a name for now. So I'm going to add in a reverb where I'm going to, first thing I'm going to do is something that I can do in Reaper, which is rather clever, is this plug-in pin connector where it says 2 in, 2 out. I can actually unpin the ins and outs and then wire them backwards, which literally is just unplug the cables and plug them backwards. So the left is now going into the right and the right is now going into the left. And you can do that with literally any plugin in Reaper. It's brilliant. And so that means that now, even with this panned off to the right on the channel, it's going to come in on the left. At least it will do when I send to it. There we go. So yeah, they're like a convolution reverb with a cathedral IR. Yeah. So these are all convolutions in Verb Suite Classics, or at least they're kind of multiple convolutions all blended together, which I think is very clever. And I'm going to start with something like that, like Reflect Church, with a bit of pre-delay on it, because the pre-delay is really what makes, and a softer attack, what makes it stand out on a mix. Way too much for what I was thinking that, but the idea is there. So let's try a non-linear. Also not what I was thinking, but let's try the our AMS 16. That might do it. Getting there. Still a little kind of nasal and quite grating in the top end. So let's bring in another mix rack after True Dynamics and see if I can just use, and this is one of the rare times in a vintage mix that I'll use something like an SSL, is try and find that. Is it kind of 1K-ish? No, it's, oh, there it is, higher up, more like 3K, and get rid of a load of that. Cool, I think we're getting somewhere. Now the real fun begins, because trumpets, my god, fitting them in a mix is a pain. Here we go. So they've all been muted. It looks like it was only from... Yeah, so it was only from later on in the song that we wanted them to even appear at all. Cool. So they all seem fairly well recorded. I think the bottom one's actually a flugel, but we'll just go ahead and assume that they're all meant to be together and add the room reverb and the plate to these. Because of course good trumpets need tons of plate reverb. If the good, the bad and the ugly taught us anything. Yeah, compare that to, which is nice, and then there's this. Suddenly I feel like I'm in a western. Perfect. So yes, a good plate reverb can make trumpets sound epic. And that's before we've done any EQ, anything. I don't think we're going to need much on the horns. We might just need to automate the volume on them a little bit. But before we start automating things, let's use our old friend, the manual, which is, I'm going to use the LA1B compressor in True Dynamics because it's got a much clearer top end and I don't really want to be muffling the top end on these. But they do need a little bit of control. Especially at these sections. That's perfect. I'd been absolutely pinning 1176s before to try and keep the trumpets in check, and all it'd really been doing is leaving me a really nasty attack on the start of the trumpets had then been going bang, da-da-da, bang. Whereas now with this very mu compressor, when it's not needed, it doesn't do much, and then as it's needed, it actually. Very mu, if I've not explained it, very mu compressors don't have a compression ratio like you would expect if you understand how most compressors work, where usually it's 3:1, 4:1, 5:1, which means beyond a threshold, if you give it 10 dB more and it's got a 5:1 ratio, it'll give you 2 dB back out because every 5 that you give it, it will only give you 1 back. Whereas the way that very mu works, it starts at 1:1, and then as you give it more and more and more level, because it's valve based, it's tube based, it's designed so that the more voltage you give that tube, the more the ratio goes up. So the more volume you give it, the higher the ratio of compression actually is. So it's got a very, very nice and soft compression characteristic until you absolutely nail it. Which is how you get that. Let's try that in the mix. Cool, so those sound fantastic. They need a tiny little bit, and I mean a tiny little bit of a low mid dip because they sound a little bit stuffy. But they also sound a little bit stuffy in the other parts of the song, but I'm not going to go crazy with it where I used to really. So let's start with the 700 Hz and see how this sounds. So that's the sound that that I just want a little bit less of. There we go. So that's 2 dB, bit more, 2.3 dB at that frequency range. Just clears them up a bit. And then of course I'm going to add that RC tube on, which I should be doing on every track if I've not already, just to make everything gel. Best sounding horns you've ever heard. Wow. That was by we got a session guy in called Stephen Greenall, who's now in the band that Sandboy essentially became, which is Last Race Home. He's a very good trumpet player, and he brought a flugel along as well. So we double tracked the trumpet and then added a flugel, and he wasn't given any sheet music for any of this. They literally were singing him the parts, singing him the horn lines, and he was doing them on the fly from his ear. And if I remember rightly, the first session he turned up drunk as a skunk, but I don't think that was this session. But that was just really funny. Cool, I've just turned off the harmonica, well, deleted the harmonica out of the trumpet solo section, so that we've got just less instrumentally going on to compete with the horns there. So we're getting there now. There's an electric guitar which they decided not to use, and I've decided not to use as well because it just doesn't help things. And then we've got these solo guitars. Yeah, so there's these trumpets here which were muted, which we're not going to use.
I do believe you, and you do believe it.
I'm also going to turn down that harmonica there because it's nice, but it's too much. So I'm going to turn it down by a good few dB.
You believe you, and you do believe. Staring right in front of me, the oceans of a single life are up.
Cool, so that harmonica is just flavour for most of the track. There we go. And so these solo guitars, which are actually acoustic guitars, like I was saying before, I've put these... Cool, so they've all been processed apart from the... I'm going to process this backwardsy one as well, actually. And make that nice and loud comparatively. And I'm just going to mix these as a group, I think. Because these are all very similar guitars, but I want them all to sit to the sides. I want them all to be... They've got a distinct low-mid muffliness, which I want to get rid of. They add something to the track, but I don't think they should be a feature. And again, this is my mix. This isn't the band going, oh, you should do this, you should do that. So I get to make the call, which is always nice. So I want these to all have... What was I saying? Yeah, so the Neve thing... There we go. There we go. So these have all got the mix bus and a nice EQ. So before any of that, let's get this Howard Benson thing going just to widen it all, because it's rather nice. There we go. So the width is the most important thing here, because it's doing a kind of a Haas effect, comb effect thing to bring it out to the sides, which will probably make it less mono-compatible. There is a button for that. But with them being a kind of an extra detail rather than a main feature, I'm not worried about that low end. And then the multiplier, it's kind of like a slight up pitch and a slight down pitch that Eventide used to do with their units. And I'm actually going to put that before Virtual Mix Rack. and what was the last thing I was going to do? True Dynamics is going to go before Virtual Mix Rack as well, and is just going to keep things in check. So this, I'm going to hope that this doesn't get used apart from this big swell here. Yeah, I'm going to push it harder. There we go. So I'm taking some out higher up as well. That there was kind of another honk in the guitar, so it's at 1.2k-ish. Let's see how this sounds in the mix. Oh, and they need tons of plate and room reverb.
And you do believe it.
Let's just use the output of True Dynamics to make up there.
I do believe you, and you do believe it. What comes of a broken heart? What comes of a broken heart? No, no, no. Comes of a broken heart. Oh.
There we go. That solo 3 was just a bit louder than the others. Needs to come down a bit.
Can't you see? The sugar coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, oh, 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 there I belong. And all the doctors in my life told me once, you told me twice, yeah. Call on me. And all the doctors in my life told me once.
Just gonna change those to be.
All the doctors in my life told me once, you told.
There we go.
Told me once, you told me twice, yeah. Call on me.
I think those overheads and room can be lifted up a bit high-end wise. Using something very vintage, which is the custom EQ. There we go. That's like using a Pultec by using the custom EQ. Just the drums could have some more.
Told me once, you told me twice, yeah. Call on me, oh. You better know where your single life. You better know where your single life. You better know where your single life. When you single life, your single life is up.
Have I used Fast Effects Finder? I have not. I'm just going to push the makeup on the vocals a little bit. Tell me a bit about Fast Effects Finder. What does that do? Because I tend to find that I know the names of all my plugins, so I click and then I'll click in an empty space and then I type the first couple of letters in there, and I didn't know there was another way of doing it, so that's the way that's always worked for me. Let's just make that a bit longer.
Golden opportunity staring right in front of me. Call on me, oh. oceans of a single life are rough. And thoughts are drifting through my head. Words are better left unsaid. No, call on me. Oh. You better know where your single life is. And I do believe you, and you do believe it too. What comes of a broken heart? What comes of a broken heart? No, no, no. Comes of a broken heart. Oh. Sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, oh, 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 you're better off alone. And all the doctors in my life told me once, you told me twice, yeah. Call on me, oh. You better know where your single life. You better know where your single life. You better know where your single life. When your single life, your single life is up. Oh. What comes of a broken heart? What comes of a broken heart? No, no, no. Comes of a broken heart. Oh. Can't you see? The sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, oh, oh, oh.
Pretty happy with that as a mix. I was just wondering why the time thing goes on forever. It's because originally we tracked this. I actually tracked several tracks at the same time in this file. So I'm just seeing if there were any rogue bits of audio anywhere. Just gonna delete these. Those are the DI tracks, and I've got separate old versions of the project that have them in, so I do not need it. But yeah, if anyone's got any feedback on the mix that they would like to critique or change, or if anyone's got any questions that they'd like to throw at me about any of this, then you are more than welcome. It's something that I've been wanting to remix this song for a long time. The original mix, unfortunately, I can't find a copy of the original mix because it's a band that ceased to exist not long after recording some of this stuff. Why do I... good question. Why do I start the song at bar 40? Well, in this case, 27. That is entirely arbitrary. I tend to leave about a 30-second leader, or in this case, a minute's worth of a leader, because I used to have issues with not just Rebase, but not just Reaper, but Cubase and Pro Tools, where if you've got a song that starts right at the start, firstly, you've got no way of putting anything in before the song. There's no way to put an intro in then. There's no way to have a lead in. If you've got any plugins that sometimes, for some reason, plugins make a strange popping noise, and especially if there's a if there's a plugin that's got some sort of fault and it goes and then goes through a reverb, you really, really pick up on it. And having that extra lead-in time means that I could render with some extra space at the start, so whatever was going wrong with plugins or reverbs or even hardware, if you're doing things with hardware, lets all buffers clear. And then when you render that, you then go to your master project and you could just shave all that off. And that just made life really easy for me, and it's just a practice that I've always kept. Because it's much like when you're working on real tape, you always give yourself a good number of seconds of winding on the tape, so that in case anything is wrong, you've got stuff to work with at the start. Just in case. Question from Joaquin Westlung. This band is called Sandboy. Sandboy don't exist anymore. The Twitter handle for them was at WeAreSandboy, as in SAND boy. But most of the members of Sandboy have gone on to make the relatively successful Manchester band. Oh, my brain's gone. What are they called? Last Race Home. LASTRACE Home. HOME. And those guys now have their own TV show on Manchester TV, and they run Big Slice Promotions, and they're doing very well for themselves, which is awesome and good to see. The original singer in Sandboy, Neil, owns his own creative agency in Manchester and is incredibly busy and just didn't have time for the band anymore, I think. But he's doing exceptionally well, and I'm talking like £1 million contracts and stuff with big names. So he's doing really well. And what was the last question? Do I prefer working with buses or groups? Justify your answer. They're the same thing. In my mind, there is no difference. A bus is a group is a bus. Anywhere that I send all of my audio to, in my mind, I call it a group. If you mean like, even when I've got tons of analog drums, I don't tend to group them because I tend to find that I find it quicker to just like right click a box over everything if I have to edit them all together, or click separately on a separate stem if I need to, say, edit a tom or a snare and just gate them manually. I don't like using groups because it takes far too long. Do I prefer working with buses or folders? Folders by a long way. When I did this mix back in 2013, the original mix, I was still using aux buses. I was doing it that way, where I wasn't sending out the master output, and then I was sending to, I still called them groups, but they were actually master, they were send and receives, like auxes. I found, well, later on in Reaper, I found that folders were a possibility that had been kind of ported over from Cubase, and I really liked it, except in Cubase it didn't work properly, whereas in Reaper it's always worked properly. Folders I much prefer because I can send tracks out of their master sends. I don't have to make complicated routing. They automatically send their sound up and out of the folder. And if I then want to export stems, I'm not causing myself problems, because when you render stems out of Reaper, if you're using the aux bus method and you've stopped tracks coming out of the master, so they go to their bus, then they don't render properly as stems because they're not coming out of the master, so they render as silence, which is exactly what you would hear out of that track. Whereas with folders, because they're going through the master but then going up through a folder, when you render, then they work properly, which is a big time saver for me and a simplification, and it just helps me have a clearer mind. Any more questions? Because it looks like this mix came together surprisingly fast. Most of this was honestly about like choice of drums, going back to the Stephen Slate drums there, like having a big fat snare and a big fat kick made life very easy for me there. In future, I might change out the hi-hats. I do always like higher hi-hats. I might try that now, actually. I'll put 13-inch hi-hats in and see if that works.
Sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, oh, 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 we better off alone.
Huh. So yeah, Zildjian's 13-inch Ks there. They seem to fit this mix much nicer.
Believe it. What comes of a broken heart? What comes of a broken heart? No, no, no.
Cool. So where do I use compression and why? I use compression everywhere. I don't worry over gain staging much, do I? Not really. I mean, I am quite particular about gain staging in sections, but because I work in what I would call an early 70s vintage mindset, everything is in analog red anyway. The snare's hitting its red there. Actually, if I look at all my, generally speaking, everything's gain staged quite well, I'd like to think. I think I pay more attention to gain staging than I talk about. I am quite conscious of gain staging, but I do purposefully drive a lot of things quite hot. The vocals are a great example. Let's have a look at the vocals. The vocals run quite hot through the channels.
And can't you see? Sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, oh.
Because it's funny that these two, the virtual channels there, they are pinning the red. But that's what I want out of those channels. They're not distortion units, but they are. Probably going to +6, +9 in the analog world, which means that since everything's calibrated to +24 as digital clipping, that means I've still got a lot more headroom than the needles would make it look like. But because I don't have the ability to read needles beyond +3, you kind of have to trust me that I'm not aiming to digitally clip anything. A couple of times, things like snares, sometimes the transients will go above 0 on one of Reaper's tracks, but that tends to get fed into something, usually either that's a saturator that chops those transients off, makes them not a problem, or like on the master output, I've actually got a -6, -7 trimmer to bring everything back down into a more reasonable analog level, because trimmer's not an analog plugin, it literally just does that, which means that everything then properly gain stages through, again, a relatively high voltage, high output analog bus. I like the sound of hot analog. I don't like the idea of overly distorted things. Which is where, like some of my favourite albums were notoriously run in the red. One of the best examples is the album Close to the Edge by Yes, which is, I think, 1972, 1973. I'm just going to check that. Yes, Close to the Edge was 1972. Yeah. And that has a very crisp, very present vintage sound. It was done in 1972. I believe it was a Neve desk, and reportedly everything was absolutely slammed in the red. But nothing was overly distorting. So gain staging, just to explain, because someone asked in chat what gain staging is. Gain staging is making sure that going from one piece of equipment to the next, whether it's digital, whether it's analog, you are sending the right levels to the next piece of gear that it would expect to see. So in the analog world, 0 in analog is generally, depending on how your equipment is set, roughly somewhere about -18 in digital, because in the analog world, when you see 0, you're usually given a large amount of what's called overhead, which is room where you can push beyond that. And it may start to add a little distortion, but you have an amount of room before it sounds really, really bad. Whereas in digital, 0 is the absolute limit, or at least it is in the way that you're supposed to think about it. There are things we can talk about with headroom in digital, but let's just say that 0 in digital is the absolute maximum. So when you compare the two, 0 on your analog meters might be -18 or -15 or -20 or whatever it's been set to. So what you'll find is that when you've got emulations of classic compressors or classic EQs or classic distortion units, guys who've only ever been trained in analog might be recording with what their meters say is -6. But doing a quick bit of maths, if you calibrated your analog to -18, you'd actually be running +12, so way over the red on the meters. So it won't sound how you expect it to sound. The meters won't do what you expected them to do. So gain staging is making sure that if you've got, say, like an EQ, then a saturator, then a compressor, then another EQ, that if you're adding volume with a compressor or an EQ or whatever, that you're making sure that you then compensate for that by bringing the level back down before the next piece of equipment so that it reacts as it's supposed to. We naturally, when you work with analog equipment, you naturally do that, because when you see all your meters going, you might add a compressor in on, say, a vocal chain, and it goes quieter, so you add a bit of level up, but you look at your meters, and if they're going crazy, you naturally bring it back so that the next piece of gear doesn't then distort. And so in the analog world, we automatically kind of gain stage because it's physical, it's right there, you see the meters, you naturally just pull things down, whereas in the digital world, we don't naturally do that a lot, which is why when we look at our analog plugins and they're not behaving how we wanted them to, either they're really distorted or they're really heavily compressing or they're just not doing what they thought they were supposed to do, it's usually because we're not feeding them the level that it's supposed to get to act the way that we thought it would. And doing that properly is gain staging. So yeah, the question from the chat, which is, do I not care about gain staging? I care very much about gain staging most of the time. It's just that it looks like I don't, because I consciously tend to drive things quite hard. Especially with a mix like this where I wanted it to feel quite late 60s, early 70s. A lot of late 60s, early 70s equipment didn't have nearly as much headroom as we have on slightly more modern equipment like late 70s, early 80s, where you could really drive the levels and it wouldn't distort very much. That's something that I could talk about for hours with the history of audio. If you listen to a song from the late 60s by most artists and listen closely, you'll find that a lot of it's really distorted. Not like guitar amp distorted, but just everything like heavily belted vocals have a lot more distortion on than you would have thought on pop songs or opera songs or, chart material. And it's only as you go to mid 70s that everything's a lot less like that. And then you go to the late 70s, early 80s, and suddenly everything sounds really clear and really clean. And then it gets to the point in the mid 80s where everything sounds really thin and sterile, and that's because engineers are used to driving tape to get a nice fat thick sound, and they're not getting that sound because the tape machines, the new modern tape machines at that time, weren't acting how they thought. And so, as it turns out, I'm quite a bit of an audio history nerd, and I really care about this kind of stuff, and I should probably talk about this more, because I really do find that being in certain eras of sound gets you to certain places, which is why I really love a lot of this like virtual analog, virtual mix rack type stuff, because if I'm trying to get to a certain place, in my mind I'm thinking, right, well, I'm putting this song roughly in this era. What equipment would they have been using and why? And then when I've answered, well, why? Because generally, like, we've got all this stuff going to this virtual tape machine. But then there's the question, well, why didn't I use tape machine on all the tracks? And I could still do that, and I might still do that. But all the top end would be a little softer, the bottom end would be quite a bit more wub wub wub. And I'm kind of treating it like a Motown type thing where everybody was in the live room and everybody was actually doing it live, which is why like Motown stuff quite often sounds quite heavily covered in reverb because they'd be using a real plate reverb. But also, it's quite distorted because the desks of the time, the mixing desks, couldn't take loads of level from everything, but also it sounds quite clear on the top end because it's not all recorded to tape section by section by section. It's not on one tape machine then transferred to another tape machine. They literally would record straight to one single tape, and that would then go off to be played back a couple of times, and then they'd make their vinyl masters. Yes, so that's that. Next question. Is that why I selected the RC Tube in Mixrack? Yes. It's something I don't usually do. So yes, I selected the RC Tube on all the channels and all the mix buses because it's based vaguely on late 60s valve-based mixing desks, which are very prone to saturation and extra distortion at the top end. Again, not like guitar amp distortion, but a whole different subtle kind of saturation, which I just felt like would add to the authenticity of this type of track. If I wanted to go early 70s, I would go with the Brit N, which is kind of a Neve type of sound, which is much higher headroom, but is all transformer and very kind of thick and has quite a full low end because of that. If I wanted to go with something that was a lot more present and mid-forward, I'd go with the Brit 4KE, which is the SSLE series from the mid-80s, which has a bit of a crunch to the channels because it was designed to take quite a lot of level, but not in the same way as the more vintage stuff at that time. The Trident I don't tend to use too much unless I'm going for a very mid-forward sound. Personally, not a big fan of the Trident sound. I'm not saying it's bad, but for me, it's not what I like. That's the way it is, and it's fine. If I was American, I might go for the USA because that's an API desk, but for me, I don't think that's the sound I was brought up with necessarily, and the Brit 4KG, for me, is the SSL G series, is kind of the early 90s G series desk, which is so clean that for me it doesn't do enough based on what I'm looking for out of a sound. So that's why in this case I went for that RC Tube. I should really have grouped them all. In fact, I'm going to go through and group them all on each group here so we can hear them all turned off. Let's just go through and group them. That's on the bass. acoustic. There we go. So, vocal. And that's another little thing that I do on a lot of my mixes is I have the virtual mix bus, just adding that flavour, because the virtual mix buses, as opposed to the virtual mix channels, have a lot higher headroom, because on a mix bus you're expecting to send several channels to it in the real world, so you design them with much higher headroom, which makes them more expensive, which is why you only do that on the on your mix buses, that kind of thing. Of course, most of the design decisions on most hardware in the real world comes down to our friend cost. And I'm going to put a mix bus on the FX group as well, just because, why not? Oh, wrong one. And run that. There we go. So this is the mix. Oh, I've undocked my mixer, which I usually do in the studio because I've got that on a separate screen. But you'd watch an audio history. Awesome. So I might do a video on that then, but it's something where I'll have to do a fair bit of research to make sure that I've got my tracks, my history right, because I can talk vaguely about this all day. When people start watching a specific video on it, the YouTube comments will come in like, you didn't talk about this, or this was wrong, or you don't know what you're talking about because this point. But as a topic like this, I'm not trying to be the arbiter of, exact detail, but the general the general feel of each era feeds into the next and really inspires me. So anyway, I'm waffling. Here's a section of the song with loads of stuff going on to the end section. And I'm going to open up this, and there's a group bypass button, so I can turn them all off at once. So here's with all of them on. And then off. There we go. So when I turn them all off, it all just sounded a little bit kind of soft and a bit ill-defined, which I could have brought out with EQ, but with EQ it'll sound much more modern. And so that's not what I wanted. The valves tend to add higher harmonics to a track, which brings out the top end until it starts to get into distortion. But it only brings out the top end when you start to feed it a lot of level. Which means that if a particular instrument is sat low in the mix, it doesn't have those higher harmonics. As soon as it comes up, it comes to the front of the mix, because those higher harmonics mean it's got more high frequency content, which means that it stands out to you, which can make a mix much more dynamic and much more lively. It'd be great analysing various songs of different decades for the history video. Yeah, I mean, I like that idea. I like that a lot. And it's actually something that I've been talking about, making a series of written articles for a friend about. So maybe I could make kind of a video companion series on that. So that's quite interesting, that I could do kind of a potted history of audio without getting too particular and talking about particular albums. Like, the difference in sound between, say, like a Genesis album from the mid-70s and then Peter Gabriel's So, which is like the ultimate SSL 80s clear mix, and less than 10 years apart, and how vastly different they sound. I mean, that kind of thing could be fascinating. I've got a copy of Peter Gabriel's So on vinyl, and even on vinyl, it's punchy, it's crisp, it's clear, but vinyls from 10 years before don't have that high end, they don't have the detail, they don't have the punch. And it's not just because of the mix, it's also because of, like I said, the technology available. Like, the tape available in 1974 had nowhere near as much headroom on the tape as it did in 1984. The machines that came out later on were clearer, all that kind of stuff. But again, that's at the high end when your budget was crazy. When you look at bands who didn't have the budget, there's a whole alternate timeline going on that's almost 4 or 5 years afterwards. And it's interesting, again, for me to see how bands on the cutting edge of technology with unlimited budgets pushed sound, and then the bands that couldn't afford it followed a few years later, because then suddenly that technology was available at affordable levels. I always find stuff like that fascinating, like getting way off topic, but Kraftwerk's, the model, I asked a friend of mine who was a junior engineer, what year did Kraftwerk's the model come out? And as a guest listening to the sound, you guessed mid-80s. And I said, nope, 1978. And it sounds much more modern, but that's because they had an absolutely crazy budget and were pushing the limits of what was possible at that time. So what did I do to eliminate the mud in the final mix? Pretty much nothing. So the final mix, so there's a little bit of a high frequency thing going on in the virtual mix rack here, which if I just... Oh, is that going to crash it? Is that going to crash it? Yeah, that's crashed it. It's funny. No DAW is immune. This is why I religiously hit the save button every couple of minutes. But yeah, I'll call this the last question. But yeah, to eliminate mud in the final mix, I just made sure I eliminated mud in every separate track. That's all you can do. It sounds like a cop-out, but it's an honest answer. That you've got to make sure that you're not letting mud build up at every stage. There is no magic trick. Let's have a look. Those mix bus things definitely help with the RC tube, or usually in my case the Brit 4KE, because they let things have more high-end detail when they get louder. But it's things like on the trumpet group, if you tuned in late, I made sure that there's about 700 hertz, there's a dip on the trumpets. The vocals, they separately had this is the main vocal, so that had a dip around 500 hertz. The harmonicas have a massive dip. So they've just got a volume dip. The guitars there all had these EQs that remove low end. So it's something that right across my mix, things don't have that low frequency, low mid kind of thing. So that's just over and over and over and over, making sure that tracks don't have that thing. This is the acoustic guitars. They didn't have any mud to begin with, so that's absolutely fine. But yeah, just making sure that if there's anything in any channel that's busy in that 500, 700 hertz region, just taking a bit of that out. And then at the end, I've got True Iron, which makes things a little clearer. Virtual Tape Machine, which just gives it a little bit of a fat low end and a nice high end. And so everything is just geared towards clarity.
Can't you see? The sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, you better off alone.
There we go. I've just pushed the vocal. That might be a bit too much. Let's just listen from the start.
Golden opportunity, staring right in front of me, call on me, the oceans of
That's funny. I instinctually went to the vocal group and turned it up at the last stage there by about a dB and a half, and just noticed that on the volume automation on the main vocal, it's dipped down by about a dB and a half. So it's funny that if you do it by feel and do it by what you hear, as long as you've gone through and done the required steps, like removing mud, proper editing, proper low end removal, all your saturation and compression. Like I say, compression for me is everywhere. That's a compressor on the bass. There's a compressor on the vocal group. There's 2 compressors on the main vocal, so that's actually 3 compressors on the vocal. The acoustic group has a compressor on, but it's not doing much.
Golden opportunity.
The organ's got a compressor on it. Yeah, True Dynamics. The harmonica's got a compressor. The trumpets have got True Dynamics, which is a compressor. Everything on my mix apart from the effects bus, as it were, everything has compression on it, which is very me. And the drums have that massive devil lock crushing compression. So yeah, for me, compression goes everywhere, but in varying amounts. Compression can be used as a character. Compression can be used to make things sit in a mix. Compression can be used really for all sorts. It's like seasoning and cooking. If you go crazy on seasoning, people go, salt and pepper. If you use the right amount at the right time, people don't notice it's there and they go, oh, this is amazing. What did you do? It's like, I can cook 2 pots of pasta and one will taste way better than the other. One was cooked with plain water and one was using plenty of salt and oil and all that kind of stuff. And if I don't tell people what I've done and just go, taste this one, taste that one, they go, eh, and they go, oh. That's exactly what it is with something like compression. The right amount on everything at the right time. This is what I was talking about with gain staging as well. It's quite analogous to cooking, where you use a little bit of seasoning when you start cooking something, a little bit of seasoning later on when the sauce is coming together, a little bit of seasoning at the end, so on and so on and so on. Then you tend to add the right flavours at the right time rather than doing it all at once and people going, oh, I can taste this. Like with audio, if I was to use one compressor on everything and just kill it, the amount of compression on every separate instrument here and the way the needles are moving, if I put that compressor on the master and saw the needle doing that, you would all hear it and you'd go, my God, that's disgusting. What are you doing? That's way too much compression. But because it's the right amount at the right time with the right settings appropriately, it all comes together. So, that I think concludes tonight's live mix. This has been an indie folk track called Call Me Up by Sandboy, and we played the track in the middle there, so I'm going to play it at the end as well with everything that's been done. As that crash, have I still got 13-inch? Yeah, I've still got 13-inch hats, so it's not changed much. I think I just lost the mix group on the effects there, which isn't a big bother. Because, again, traditionally, you might not have that go through a bus. You might just patch them straight to the mixer to the tape machine. And, yeah, that should do us nicely. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. Hit the like button if you've found this useful, because I've certainly found this one enjoyable. And we'll be back next week. Let's have a look. So Chris has sent me another song to work on. So I might actually do that right from the beginning and do a very heavy metal track, but actually going through all the wave files and all that kind of stuff and doing a mix preparation as well as the full mix to talk you through the way that I set things up. Because the way that I've been doing this last couple of weeks is I've spent an hour or two before the show with the Reaper project and looking through the mess that I've made for myself several years ago, or what I've been sent or that kind of thing, and setting it all up how I would like it. So what I might do is go through and show you something that's not quite how I would use to mix, and then set it up like I would use to mix. So I think we're going to do another pop punky one middle of the week, and then do a heavy metal one, probably more like Saturday. So yeah, lots and lots to go on. I've got more pop punk than I can shake a stick at. I might actually do one where I've been intending to re-record some guitars. So there's a pop punk track where some of the guitars were, in hindsight, unusable. So I might re-record those, or I might do one where I know everything was recorded properly. but I'll have a look at those. And then, yeah, metal. There's always the podcast on Thursday, and there's more videos that I'm editing this week. So check everything out. Thank you, everybody, for watching. This, just to round the stream out, is Call Me Up by Sandboy, the 2020 mix.
Golden opportunity staring right in front of me. Call on me. The oceans of a single life are rough, and thoughts are drifting through my head. Words are better left unsaid. No, call on me. You better know where your single life is. And I do believe you, and you do believe it too. What comes of a broken heart? What comes of a broken heart? No, comes of a broken heart. Can't you see? Sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, we better off alone. And all the doctors in my life told me once, you told me twice, yeah. Call on me, you better know where your single life. You better know where your single life. You better know where your single life. When your single life, your single life is up. No. And I do believe you, and you do believe it too. What comes of a broken heart? What comes of a broken heart? No, comes of a broken heart. Sugar-coated memories taste sour now to me, and I say, we better off alone. Not better off alone.
Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you in the next stream. Goodbye.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos, as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter, or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.